In the dark corridors of a high-security prison, where secrets are buried as deep as the concrete walls, Julia, a correctional officer, thought she could keep her forbidden affair with a violent inmate hidden. But when the body of Travis, the man who had captured her heart and her conscience, is found lifeless in his cell, everything she's worked to protect begins to unravel. Betrayal, manipulation, and guilt collide, leading Julia to a fateful decision, one that will destroy not just her career, but her entire life. In a world where trust is a luxury she can no longer afford, Julia must face the ultimate question: how far will she go to protect the truth she's been running from? The sky was just beginning to break with the pale light of dawn as Julia stepped into the facility. Her boots clicked softly on the cold concrete, and the routine sounds of the prison, a distant clanging door, the murmur of staff preparing for the shift change, greeted her like any other day. It was supposed to be ordinary. Another day, another round of checks. But as soon as she stepped through the security doors, she was met with chaos. "Julia, you need to come with me," a voice said urgently. She turned to see Officer Harris, his face pale, his jaw clenched. Before she could ask what was wrong, he added, "Travis. He's dead." The words hit her like a cold wave. Travis, the inmate she had been sneaking around with for the past 6 months, was dead. How? She followed Harris down the narrow corridor, heart pounding in her chest. Her mind screamed, but no sound came out. They stopped in front of Travis's cell. The door was wide open. Blood, dark and thick, had begun to stain the floor beneath him, seeping through the cracks. His body was twisted in an unnatural position, eyes wide open in eternal surprise. Julia's breath caught in her throat as she took in the scene. His face was bruised, battered from what appeared to be a violent struggle. His arms were positioned strangely, almost as if he'd tried to fight someone off. "It looks like he didn't go quietly," Harris murmured, his voice betraying the tension in the air. Julia's eyes darted around the room, taking in the whispers of the other officers and inmates that had gathered at the scene. Some were pointing fingers, others quietly murmuring. No one knew what had happened, but everyone had their suspicions. "Is it?" Julia started to ask, but she couldn't bring herself to say the word aloud. She didn't need to. The tension was thick in the air. "No signs of forced entry," Harris added, his eyes narrowing. "But, there's something off about this." Julia swallowed hard. Something off. It wasn't just the crime scene, it was the feeling deep in her gut. The feeling that this wasn't just a routine prison fight gone wrong. That this death was connected to her in a way she couldn't deny any longer. Julia stood frozen, her thoughts racing. She had been reckless. Too reckless. She had let her emotions cloud her judgment, let Travis slip past her carefully constructed barriers. And now everything was falling apart. Her mind flashed back to the first time she had met him, his intense eyes, the way he talked to her, the way he seemed to see right through her. She remembered the late-night conversations, the stolen glances, the forbidden touches in the shadows of the prison yard. The thrill, the danger. It had started as something small, a distraction from her lonely marriage, her unfulfilled life. But it had grown into something darker, something deeper. And now Travis was dead. A shiver ran down Julia's spine. She knew what this meant. If anyone found out about their affair, her career was over. Her marriage would crumble. She could end up in prison herself. The weight of the secret she'd buried so deep within her was now threatening to consume her entirely. The days after the discovery of Travis's death were a blur of tension. Word of the death and the circumstances surrounding it spread like wildfire. The whispers started quietly, just a murmur here and there, but soon it was a steady hum throughout the prison. Julia couldn't escape the feeling that every pair of eyes was on her. Every conversation, every glance between officers, inmates, and even the custodial staff felt charged with suspicion. She was always on edge, her every move scrutinized. She caught random snippets of conversation, voices dropping to a hush as she passed, glances exchanged when she entered a room. It didn't take much for the rumors to start. The whispers about her involvement in Travis's death, the secret affair they'd shared. "Have you seen Julia today?" one officer had asked another during a break in the locker room. "Something's off. She looks like she knows more than she's letting on." The word sliced through Julia like a knife. More than she was letting on, they were right. She knew exactly how deep the hole she'd dug for herself went. And every passing minute brought her closer to being buried alive by it. Late one evening, Julia sat in her car, parked in the nearly empty lot outside the prison, her fingers gripping the steering wheel. She looked out through the windshield, watching the fading light as the last of the day disappeared behind the walls of the facility. Her mind was a storm of thoughts, regrets, and overwhelming fear. This affair, this reckless, dangerous mistake had been an escape. A momentary distraction from her failing marriage and her unfulfilled life. But it had become more than that. It had become an obsession. And now, it had cost Travis his life. And possibly, her own. Her thoughts turned to David, her husband, sitting at home, unaware of the destruction Julia had caused. She had spent months lying to him, keeping secrets, all in the name of filling a void that could never be filled. Now she could see the damage clearly. Her career. Her marriage. Her reputation. All at stake, and for what? A fleeting moment of attention, a temporary high that had ended in murder. As the realization settled deep in her bones, Julia knew there was no way to fix what had been broken. The lies, the guilt, the fear, it was all unraveling, piece by piece. And there was no one she could turn to for help. Her life, it seemed, had just been sentenced. And the punishment was only just beginning. Julia sat across from David at the small, worn kitchen table, the clock ticking louder than ever. It was late, far later than usual, but she had come home to find him absorbed in his own quiet world, just as she had for the last few months. He was watching TV, flipping through the same channels for the third time tonight. He hadn't noticed she was home yet, not that he would have. He hadn't noticed her in months. The air between them felt like a thick fog, something unsaid, something missing. David was still the man she had married, but something had changed, something deep within the rhythm of their life together. It was a quiet drift, an emotional distance she couldn't ignore anymore. Their conversations had become robotic, filled with polite words that never reached their hearts. His eyes rarely lingered on her, his touch had grown distant, and her soul, though never openly acknowledged, began to ache with a loneliness that even the comfort of home couldn't soothe. She stared at him, but her mind wandered to a faraway place. She thought of the recent weeks, the hours spent at work, the long patrols, the shifting of her attention from the mundane to something far darker. The fleeting moments she'd shared with Travis, an inmate whose life was miles away from her world, yet had drawn her in completely. The first time she noticed Travis was during one of the evening head counts. He had an air of defiance about him, his sharp features framed by messy dark hair and piercing eyes that never seemed to leave her. He was just another inmate, a violent offender, dangerous to most, but something about him intrigued her. The whispers about him from other officers were endless. Trouble, they'd say. A manipulator. But Julia saw a different side to him. In their brief exchanges, when he would throw her a quiet smile, she saw a different person altogether. There was an intelligence behind his dark eyes, a glint of something that felt almost like recognition. She wasn't sure when it started, but the simple nods turned into longer conversations, innocent enough at first, covering basic pleasantries. He'd ask about her day, and she found herself talking more than she intended. They'd talk about the weather, the frustrations of the job, even her failed attempts at learning the guitar. Then, as the weeks went by, the conversations deepened. He'd ask questions that felt personal, making her feel like maybe, just maybe, he saw her. One night, as the lockdown bell rang, signaling the end of another long shift, Travis's words lingered in her mind. "It's hard, isn't it? The weight of it all." He was right. Her life had started to feel like a series of monotone routines. The quiet distance between her and David had become unbearable, and here, in the quiet of a prison, Travis was offering something new: attention, something her marriage no longer provided. It was late one evening when the first touch occurred. A brush of his fingers against her arm, so light she thought she might have imagined it. But then, when it happened again so deliberate this time, it hit her like a rush of blood to the head. "Julia, you're always so tense," he'd said, his voice low, rough around the edges. "I bet the job's taking a toll on you, huh?" There was a strange sincerity in his words, and Julia found herself swallowing back the instinct to push him away. She had every reason to resist. He was an inmate. She was a correctional officer. What they shared was nothing more than the shadows of a lonely heart reaching for something, anything real. But loneliness makes the heart do dangerous things. The brief touch lingered like an unspoken promise, and in that moment, something shifted. What had started as a harmless flirtation began to turn into something she couldn't control. As the days passed, they grew closer in secret, their stolen moments more frequent. His words wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing her loneliness. And every time she saw him, her pulse quickened: his smile, the touch of his hand when he passed her a note, the intensity of his gaze. In the solitude of her own thoughts, Julia had begun to believe hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be something that wasn't just fleeting. Her marriage was unraveling, and with each moment she spent with Travis, she became more and more entangled in the forbidden. Their affair deepened. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. It was manipulative, in ways Julia didn't want to acknowledge. Travis began to make requests, demands, really. At first, it was small things: slightly bending the rules for him, a private meeting in a darkened hallway, a fleeting kiss under the guise of a pat on the back. She could justify it as harmless, a way to relieve her frustrations, to fill the void that had grown between her and David. But it didn't stop there. The things Travis began asking for became more dangerous. Special privileges, ignoring basic security protocols, giving him access to things he shouldn't have. He demanded, and she complied. His eyes would meet hers in a way that made her believe he understood her like no one else did, no one but him. And she was lost in that belief. He knew what to say, how to manipulate her, feeding off her guilt, her loneliness, her growing desperation. With every secret favor she granted him, the line between right and wrong blurred further. And as it blurred, she started to lose sight of where she began and where this man, this dangerous, intoxicating man, ended. One night, as the sound of a distant siren echoed through the dark halls, Travis leaned in close to her, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "what would happen if we just disappeared? No rules. No cages." Julia's heart skipped a beat. His words felt like an invitation to freedom, to something beyond the monotonous, predictable life she had built. But that feeling of freedom was nothing more than the first taste of poison. At home, the tension between Julia and David thickened. She came back from her shifts more exhausted than ever, her mind too occupied with thoughts of Travis to be present for David. She would find him sitting in the same spot every night, eyes on the TV, but never really watching it. The silence between them grew heavier, louder with every passing day. David had noticed the change. Julia was distant, distracted, her mind elsewhere. He tried to fill the gap with small talk, asking about her day, about the shift, but the conversation always fell flat. He had no idea that every time she walked out the door, she was stepping into a different world, one that was far darker than he could ever imagine. One evening, as she closed the door behind her, David turned to her, his voice quiet but filled with unspoken hurt. Where do you go every night, Jules? You're not the woman I married. She stopped in her tracks. The question hung in the air, cold and accusing. She looked at him, unsure of how to answer, unsure of what he'd even want to hear. I'm tired, David. I just need some space. It was the same excuse she had been using for weeks now. He nodded, though his eyes betrayed a deep, unsatisfied pain. Meanwhile, Randy, an officer with years of experience, had started to notice Julia's odd behavior. Her every glance toward Travis, the way she stilled every time he passed, the slight blush on her cheeks that never quite faded. He wasn't an idiot. He had seen it before: officers getting too close to the inmates, letting things slip. I don't trust her, Randy muttered one evening to a fellow officer. She's been acting strange, his partner replied, scratching his head. You think it's what we're thinking? Randy watched Julia from a distance. She was trying to keep it all together, but Randy knew something was off. Too much secrecy, too many questions left unanswered. And the way she flinched every time someone mentioned Travis, it was all adding up. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of what Julia had done pressed down on her like a suffocating fog. She found it hard to breathe, harder still to face her reflection in the mirror. Every glance in the mirror reminded her of the betrayal that had consumed her, betraying her marriage, her career, and worst of all, herself. The stolen kisses, the whispered promises in dark hallways, they haunted her. Julia lay awake at night, staring up at the ceiling, her mind swirling with images of Travis. She had crossed lines she never thought she would. The guilt churned within her, gnawing at her, until it felt like her very soul was fractured beyond repair. Each day that passed, the reality of what she had done grew more evident. How had she let herself get this far? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. David stood in the doorway, his eyes tired, distant. He didn't know, not yet, but his silence spoke volumes. He could sense her growing distance, her inability to meet his gaze. It wasn't just the long hours at the prison, it was something more. She could feel him slipping away, just as she had. Julia felt trapped, torn between the life she had built and the one she was destroying. The guilt was unbearable. She had betrayed both David and her professional code, and the weight of it was suffocating. Randy had been working at the facility long enough to recognize when things didn't add up. And Julia? Well, Julia's behavior had been increasingly erratic. He had noticed it in passing: a strange tension in the way she moved around the prison, the way she avoided certain areas, the almost obsessive way she made sure Travis was kept under her watchful eye. It didn't take long for Randy's sharp instincts to pick up on the signs. One afternoon, as Julia moved through the corridors, he intercepted her at the security desk, watching her carefully. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. You seem a little distracted lately, Julia. Everything all right? She stiffened, forcing a smile. Just tired, Randy. Nothing more. But Randy wasn't fooled. He'd seen the way she looked at Travis, the way she lingered longer than necessary around his cell. It was too familiar, the kind of thing that led to trouble. As the days went on, Randy couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. He began to quietly follow her, watching her interactions with Travis more closely. The whispers from the other officers hadn't gone unnoticed either. They had begun to murmur about Julia and Travis, though no one dared say it outright. But Randy didn't need the rumors, his gut told him everything he needed to know. By now, Julia had crossed a line she couldn't undo. What started as stolen moments and hidden glances had turned into something far darker. Travis, once charming and flirtatious, now seemed to have an iron grip on her emotions. He had become a master manipulator, using her guilt to bend her to his will. Travis's demands started to grow: small favors at first, then bigger requests. He wanted privileges, things he knew he shouldn't have access to. A more comfortable cell, extra food, an unguarded moment in the yard. At first, Julia resisted, but the fear of what he might expose if she refused started to consume her. Every day, the pressure built, until the line between right and wrong became a blurred mess of desperation. One late night, when the prison was quiet and most of the staff had gone off shift, Julia found herself alone with Travis in a secluded corner of the yard. He was standing there, waiting, his expression unreadable. She could feel the pull toward him, the dangerous allure she had no control over. "You know what I want," Travis said, his voice low, almost a growl. "And you know you're going to help me get it?" Julia's pulse quickened. She swallowed hard, fighting the impulse to look away. "What do you mean?" He took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers as he leaned in, his voice softer now. "You've already helped me more than you think. I just need a little more cooperation. You want to protect your secret, don't you? Keep it all hidden? Then help me." She nodded, unable to find her voice, trapped in a web of fear and guilt. He knew exactly how to play her. And for the first time, Julia realized how deep into this mess she had fallen. The realization hit her like a slap across the face. She wasn't in control anymore. Travis had the upper hand. The tension at home became palpable. Julia could feel it in every silent dinner, every unanswered question. David was more withdrawn than ever, his once tender glances replaced by an almost clinical observation of her. He no longer asked about her day, and when he did, it was perfunctory, just a routine question, devoid of warmth. The love that once anchored their marriage had slowly eroded. One night, after a particularly long shift, Julia came home to find him sitting in the same spot, staring at his phone. His dinner was still untouched on the table. "David," she said softly, stepping into the room. He didn't look up. "Yeah." A tight knot formed in her stomach. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was still haunted by the guilt, by the fear that David could sense something was wrong. That he could see through her facade. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice distant. "Just tired, I guess." But she saw the sadness in his eyes, the quiet frustration that he couldn't voice. Julia had become a stranger to him, and he to her. The silence between them was now more suffocating than any argument they had ever had. She stood there, rooted to the spot, not knowing what to say. The weight of her double life, of the affair with Travis, hung heavy in the air. She had no answers to give him. And in that moment, Julia realized just how far they had drifted apart. And how much she had destroyed. It wasn't long before the consequences of Julia's actions began to show. The lines between professional and personal were now so blurred, so tangled, that Julia was unable to tell where one ended and the other began. Travis had made it clear what he wanted. And in her desperation to keep their affair a secret, she started giving in to his demands. At first, it was little things: extra food for his cell, the occasional unlogged break. But soon, it escalated to something far more dangerous. Travis asked for something that could not be ignored: access to files, information he was never meant to see. Julia hesitated at first. The rules were clear: security was paramount. But the fear of Travis exposing everything, of her life falling apart, drove her to make a decision she would later regret. She'd let him in. She'd bent the rules for him. And now, there was no turning back. It was a few days after the special treatment incident that Julia's world began to unravel. She was walking down the hall when she saw Randy leaning against the wall near the guard station. His arms were folded, his eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. "Julia," he said, his voice quiet but full of weight, "we need to talk." Her heart raced. She could feel her palms growing clammy, a sudden chill running through her. She wanted to walk away, to avoid whatever confrontation was coming, but something told her that running wouldn't help anymore. Randy stepped forward, his gaze narrowing. I know, Julia. I know about you and Travis. I have proof. Pictures. Notes. Everything. Julia's mouth went dry, and she instinctively backed away. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She had spent months hiding her affair, thinking she was invincible, but now Randy had all the evidence he needed. He tilted his head slightly, watching her closely. I could report you. Destroy everything for you. But I'm offering you something that could keep us both out of this mess. Her mind raced, her pulse hammering in her chest. She was caught. Trapped in her own lies. The weight of her guilt flooded her, but the fear of exposure, of losing everything, pushed her to consider his offer. Julia's breath caught as she stood there, staring at Randy. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she knew she had no choice. Her options had evaporated. Her marriage was already a wreck, and if her affair came to light, her entire career would collapse in a heartbeat. What do you want, Randy? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Randy smirked, stepping closer, his presence overwhelming. I want Travis transferred to a different facility. You make that happen, and I'll keep my mouth shut. No one has to know about the affair. Julia's insides twisted in knots. This was her life. She was bargaining with her career, her marriage, her very identity. But Travis had to be silenced. She had to protect herself, her future. I'll do it, she said, barely believing the words that left her mouth. She was betraying her ethics, her duty. But what other choice did she have? Randy nodded slowly, his smile widening. Good. It's all in your hands now. As Randy walked away, Julia stood frozen, feeling the weight of her decision press down on her. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She was in too deep, and there was no going back. Julia barely slept that night. The decision she'd made sat heavily on her chest, like a weight that she couldn't shake. The next day, when she entered the facility, she found herself dreading the inevitable encounter with Travis. She had made a deal with Randy, sacrificing her dignity and moral compass to save herself. But now, as she passed by the holding cells, she could feel Travis's eyes on her. She had known him long enough to recognize the shift in his demeanor. Something was wrong. She stopped at his cell, locking eyes with him through the bars. His gaze was intense, cold. What did you do? Travis's voice was low, almost a growl. Julia's stomach lurched. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb with me, Julia, he snapped. I know what's happening. I know about the transfer. You're selling me out, aren't you? The realization hit Julia like a punch to the gut. Randy had been playing both sides, and now Travis knew. His face twisted with anger. I trusted you. And now? Now you're going to let them send me away? You think this is the end? You think I'll just let it happen? Julia opened her mouth to respond, but the words died in her throat. Fear, deep and sharp, cut through her. She had pushed him too far. He had always been volatile, but this was different. Don't you dare, Travis, she whispered, her voice shaking. Please. You have to trust me. But he was already beyond reason. The rage in his eyes made it clear he wasn't going to be silenced. Julia's heart raced as she made her way to the back of the prison, where she had arranged to meet Travis one last time. The plan was simple: calm him down, reassure him that everything would be fine. She had to keep him quiet, keep him from escalating things any further. When she entered the small, dimly lit room, Travis was already there, pacing, his fists clenched. He looked up when she entered, his expression fierce and filled with contempt. You think you can control me? He spat, his voice venomous. You think I'll just let you toss me aside? After everything we shared? After everything you did for me? Julia felt the cold sweat on her skin. She stepped forward, trying to remain calm, but the fear bubbling inside her was hard to contain. Travis, please. Before she could finish, he lunged at her. The force of his grip on her arms was like a vice. You don't get it, do you? I'm not some pawn for you to use. I'm not done with you yet, Julia. The air between them grew thick with tension, and Julia's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen him like this. The rage was overpowering, unhinged. She tried to push him off, but he only tightened his grip, pulling her closer. With a cry, she stumbled backward, her mind a blur of panic. And in the chaotic moment, a sharp object, a piece of metal, something she hadn't even noticed was within reach. Without thinking, she grabbed it, swinging it toward Travis in a blind panic. The blow landed with sickening force. Travis stumbled back, his expression twisted in shock and pain. Julia stood frozen, breathing heavily, staring at him. He fell to the ground, his body convulsing once before lying still. Silence. Julia's heart raced in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had just killed him. Julia stood there, her eyes locked onto Travis's motionless body. The reality of what she had done hit her like a slap to the face. The man she had once been so emotionally entangled with, the one who had controlled her every move, was now lying dead at her feet. Her hands trembled as she reached out, unsure whether she should check for a pulse, unsure whether it mattered anymore. It was done. She had done it. She had killed him in the heat of the moment, in self-defense, in a desperate bid to stop him from destroying everything. But now, there was no turning back. Her life, the carefully constructed lies, the secret affair, all of it crumbled in an instant. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Julia stumbled backward, her mind reeling, her chest heaving with panic. The room around her seemed to spin. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. She had just taken a life, his life, and it wasn't out of self-defense anymore. It was out of sheer desperation. The man who had controlled her, manipulated her, was gone. And now, she was left with nothing. No career. No marriage. No redemption. As she stood over his body, the truth of what she had done settled deep within her. There was no escape from this. The repercussions would be far worse than any affair could have ever been. And in that moment, as the silence enveloped her, Julia realized she had just sentenced her life to something far worse than prison.